Good morning, dear students. Secondary one. Today, I'm going to explain with you Unit 9, whose title is A Good Education. I think a good education should be. I think it could happen if you deal with the 4 main items, which are reading, writing, listening, and speaking, of course together with grammar. So Unit 9 today gives you an idea about a writer whose name is Charlotte Bronte. This writer is from England, and she has become a very famous author, actually together with her 2 sisters. So the 3 of them were famous authors, famous writers. Let me read to you the text about her famous novel, which is called Jane Eyre. As I told you, it starts with a hint about the writer. So Charlotte Bronte was born in England in 1816. She and her 2 sisters all became famous authors, as I told you. Charlotte Bronte's famous, or let us say most famous book is Jane Eyre. It was written in 1847. Jane Eyre was an orphan who lived with her cousins and her wealthy aunt. Sorry. Her aunt was called Mrs. Reed. The family was unkind, and they did not want Jane to live with them. Jane was sent away to school. Jane was happy to go to Lowood School. Of course, she was happy because she expected that school to be better than the house of her aunt, where she lived among cousins who didn't like her. But she was unlucky because the owner of the school, Mr. Brocklehurst, was very cruel. So the students lived an unhappy life. Of course, all the students together with Jane Eyre. Finally, cruel Mr. Brocklehurst was told to leave the school, which is good for the students, of course. 6 years later, Jane became a teacher at Lowood School, at the same school where she learned. After 2 years, Jane decided to apply for a job as a governess. A governess is somebody who teaches students, but at home, not at school. Governesses were often employed by rich families. She started to teach a young French girl called Adele at a big house called Thornfield Hall. The owner of the house was Mr. Rochester. Jane enjoyed her new job and became friends with Mrs. Fairfax, the kind housekeeper. One night, there was a fire at Thornfield Hall. Jane saved Mr. Rochester from the fire. He said that the fire was started by a servant called Grace, but Grace did not lose her job, which was surprising to Jane. Jane did not understand, but she thought that there was a secret in the house. A secret why she was the cause of this fire, and at the same time she kept her job. She didn't lose her job. Jane decided to leave Thornfield Hall, but she could not forget it. This is a summary about Jane Eyre, which was a very famous novel by Charles Bronte. Now, let's shift to some new vocabulary, which I think they are not new for you, but let's have an idea about the definition of these vocabulary. If we say cruel, of course, cruel is the opposite of kind. So, cruel means unkind and hurting others. Are you cruel? Of course not. I know my students well. The word governess. The governess, as I told you, it was a job which was common for rich families. So, governess means a woman who teaches children in their homes. What about housekeeper? Housekeeper, of course, is a servant who looks after the whole house. Of course, you know the meaning of orphan. Orphan is a child whose parents are dead. And what about servant? Of course, servant is a person who works for people in their house. Now, you got an idea about the definition of some vocabulary in this text. Let's go back to the text. In number 2, he asks you which phrase best explains what the story is about. Can we say the story is about the importance of kindness and honesty, or about the importance of having a lot of money, or about the importance of working with a rich family? The importance of kindness and honesty. To be kind and honest, Jane Eyre could save Mr. Rochester from the fire. She was honest. And she was kind to her cousins, although they were cruel to her. But she didn't make any trouble there till they sent her to school. Now, number 4, are these sentences true or false? If it is true, say it's true. If it is false, please correct them. Correct the false sentences. Mrs. Reed sends Jane to Thornfield Hall. Is it correct? Of course not. Mrs. Reed sends Jane to Lowood School, where she was unlucky because the owner of the school was a cruel man. Number 2, Mr. Brooklehurst owned the school, but he was cruel. What do you think? I think yes. He was the owner of the school and he was a cruel man. That's why all the students had a very bad life. And also Jane Eyre was unlucky. Number 3, 6 years later, Jane was the owner of Lowood School. Wow! Did she buy the school? How could she become the owner of the school? I think it's false. The correct sentence is 6 years later, Jane was a teacher in the same school. Number 4, Jane taught a girl called Adelaide. I think her name was Adele. Number 5, Mr. Rochester saved Jane from a fire. Oh, on the contrary, it's Jane who saved Mr. Rochester from the fire. You remember, of course. There was a secret in Thornfield Hall. Yes, there was a secret. Do you remember what the secret was? Of course, although Grace, who was the housekeeper, no, sorry, not the housekeeper, Grace was a servant. The housekeeper was called Fairfax, who was friend with Jane Eyre. But Grace was a servant and she caused the fire which was about to destroy the house, but Jane Eyre saved the house and saved its owner. At the same time, the owner didn't fire the servant who caused this fire. So that was the secret. Now, let's shift to the grammar of this unit. In this unit, we are going to remember the active voice and the passive voice. Of course, you know, when we say active sentence, it means we put the focus on the subject. When we read the sentence, the focus is on the subject. So it starts with the subject and then verb and then object. But when we turn it into passive, we put the focus on the object. So we start the sentence with the object and then the verb and then the new subject, which was an old subject. So it's a new object now at the end of the sentence. The active and passive in this lesson is concerning the past simple and the past perfect. So let's go back to the past simple and past perfect. What's the relationship, first of all, between the past simple and the past perfect? Of course, you see that both of them are past. It means the two actions happened in the past. But one of them happened before the other. That's why we use some words to arrange the verbs in the past, which happened first and which happened later. Do you remember the rule which I told you before, that the past perfect comes after and before? It's a kind of rhythm only to remember. To remember, after and before, you put the past perfect. And if you have another action or another verb, you put it in the past simple. Now, let's have the rule. The past perfect is after the word after. Only after? Only the word after? Of course not, because we have some other words which mean after, like as soon as. Instead of saying, after I had gone home, I took my dinner, you can say, as soon as I had gone home, I took my dinner. And also the word until. But until here goes with the negative. So you would say, I didn't take my dinner until I had gone back home. So first you went back home and then you took your dinner. So it's a kind also of arranging the actions which happened in the past. What about the past simple? So the past simple is after before. After the word before. Before, which sometimes means by the time. By the time also means before. Let's go through some examples. After I had reached the station, the train left. You can also say, when I had reached the station, the train left. Here you have two actions. Reaching the station or arriving at the station, and the departure of the train. The train left. Which of them happened first? When you say, after I had reached the station, the train left. So, what happened first? I had reached the station. I went to the station first. And after that, the train left. So, the train left after my arrival, when I already arrived at the station. Let's say the same example in another way. When I reached the station, the train had left. So when I reached, in the past simple, the station, the train had left. Had left is the past perfect. So what happened first? Is it you arrived first? Sorry? Or the train left first? When you have the train had left, it means that this action happened before reaching the station. So the departure of the train happened first, and then you went to the station. In this case, you didn't find the train. This is the difference between the first sentence and the second one. In the first sentence, you reached the station first, and then the train left. In the second sentence, the train left first, and then you reached the station. You get the difference? Before I visited Mary, I had bought a bunch of flowers. So, what happened first? I had bought a bunch of flowers, and then I visited Mary. So, the action which happened first should be put in the form of past perfect. Had bought. And the action which happened then, later, should be put in the past simple, which is visited. I didn't visit Mary until I had bought a bunch of flowers. This is the idea of until when you use it with the negative. Sorry. So, I didn't visit Mary until I had bought a bunch of flowers. So what happened first? First, I had bought a bunch of flowers. After that, I visited Mary. If I hadn't bought a bunch of flowers, maybe I would have changed my mind and not visit Mary, cancel the visit. Another example, it was not until I had arrived home that a visitor came. It was not until I had arrived home that a visitor came. When you use it was not until, you need to use the word that. And that is always followed by a complete sentence. A visitor came. So what happened first? I had arrived home. And after that, the visitor came. So not before my arrival, but after my arrival, the visitor came. Another example, it was only when I had arrived home that a visitor came. So you can express the idea in two ways. It was not until, or it was only when. Both of them are the same, but for the language you should use it in that way. It was not until I had arrived that the visitor came, or it was only when I had arrived home that a visitor came. You got it? Let's go on with the examples. Expressing or highlighting where you should put the past perfect and where you should use the past simple. As soon as I had arrived home, a visitor came. The same idea, but using as soon as, exactly as you use after. As soon as I had arrived home, what happened? A visitor came. And the next one is different. The same meaning, but different in the language. I had no sooner arrived home than a visitor came. I had no sooner arrived home than a visitor came. So where are the two actions which happened in the past? I had arrived home. So had arrived is the first action, and the second action is the visitor came. So had arrived in the past perfect, after that the visitor came, past simple. Notice here, with no sooner, you use the word then. You can't use no sooner without the word then. And the second sentence is in another form. It's starting with no sooner. So, no sooner had I arrived home than a visitor came. What's the difference between the two sentences? Can you tell me? Can you think? I had no sooner arrived home than a visitor came, and no sooner had I arrived home than a visitor came. You see the difference in structure? When you start with no sooner, you should put the form of the sentence in the form of a question. Not to say, I had arrived. No, you should say, had I arrived. Had I arrived. It's in the form of a question. Why? Because you start with no sooner. No sooner had I arrived home than a visitor came. And this is another way, also starting with hardly. It also should be in the form of a question. If you start with hardly or scarcely, rarely. Let's say the sentence when hardly is in the middle of the sentence, and then say it when hardly is at the beginning of the sentence. You start with, I had hardly or scarcely arrived home when a visitor came. I had hardly arrived home. It means as soon as I had arrived home, the visitor came. So where is the verb when you have hardly? Hardly is in the middle of the two parts of the past perfect. The past perfect is had arrived, and in the middle you have hardly. Do you remember already and just? We say, I have already done my homework. The visitor has just left. So has left, and in the middle you have just, or has done. I have already done my homework, so it's have done with already in the middle. Hardly is the same. It should be in the middle. I had hardly arrived home when a visitor came. So what happened first? I had arrived home. What happened next? A visitor came. And this is the form of the sentence. Notice that when you use hardly, you use the word when in the other part of the sentence. When you use no sooner, you have to use the word then in the other part of the sentence. So again, I had hardly arrived home when a visitor came. What if we start with hardly? How will the structure be if you start with hardly? It's the same as when you start with no sooner. So, hardly had I arrived home when a visitor came. Hardly had I arrived, not I had arrived, no, in the form of a question. Had I arrived? So hardly had I arrived home when a visitor came. This is another form. Having arrived home, a visitor came. So you start here with the having. Having arrived home. Why having? Because you can't start the sentence with a verb. If you say have, you can't. You need the subject at the beginning of the sentence. And you know well that when we add ing to the verb, I mean gerund, when you use the gerund, it could be subject. So here, having arrived home, a visitor came. The last sentence or the last example, after arriving home, a visitor came. After, why arriving? Why we don't have here had plus pp, which is the form of the past perfect, which comes after, as we said before. Why arriving? Yes, because we don't have subject here. If I have a subject, like I, so after I had arrived home. Like he, so after he had arrived home. But here we don't have a subject. So we use the gerund. After arriving home, a visitor came. I hope you got the idea. I hope you know how to arrange the verbs or the actions which happened in the past, how to arrange them, which one before the other, which one after the other, which one should be put in past perfect and which one should be put in past simple, and how you use no sooner than and how you use hardly when. And of course, after, as soon as, until, before, by the time, all these words are connected with the past simple together with the past simple. Next time, we'll talk about how to turn from active to passive and from passive voice to active voice using the past simple and the past perfect. Thank you and goodbye.